These are 20 Victorian allotment tricks that grew more food per square foot than anything sold in a garden center today, and not one of them required a bag, a bottle, or a trip anywhere at all. Before synthetic fertilizers existed, before pesticide sprays, before polytunnel film, British kitchen gardeners produced quantities and varieties of food that would stop any modern allotment holder in their tracks. Standard practice in every serious British kitchen garden before the First World War, each one of these methods still works today. What killed them off was not a better idea arriving to replace them, but an industry that found it could sell a product in place of knowledge people once passed down for free. Subscribe before we get into the list, because we cover this kind of forgotten knowledge every week, and this series is only beginning. South-facing walls were treated as the most productive ground on the entire plot, and Victorian kitchen gardeners used every inch of them. Apple trees, pear trees, peaches, and apricots were trained flat against the brick in a system called espalier, horizontal branches tied at precise intervals along wires fixed into the mortar. Brick absorbed heat through the day and gave it back through the night, which pushed the growing season weeks further at each end than open ground ever could. A single tree trained this way produced fruit reliably and in conditions where the same variety grown freestanding would never ripen, and the yield per square foot outran any freestanding orchard tree of the same age. Victorian head gardeners called the South Wall the warmest acre in England and grew crops against it that had no business surviving the British climate at all. Those walls still stand in hundreds of gardens. What went missing was not the wall, but the knowledge of what to do with it. Outdoor grapevines grew against those same walls in every serious Victorian kitchen garden, trained on a system called rod and spur, where one main stem ran vertically and all fruiting shoots were cut hard back to 2 buds each winter. 2 seasons of patience let the framework establish itself, and by the 3rd year, the vine produced reliably on British soil without any glass at all. By the 1960s, that understanding had essentially gone, replaced by the belief that British grapes needed a greenhouse, and the vines themselves had not changed at all, which is the part worth sitting with. Gooseberries and red currants across Victorian allotments were trained as standards, grown on a single upright stem to about 4 feet before a head of branches was allowed to develop at the top. Fruit hanging at that height meant slugs and sawfly could not easily reach it. The soil beneath stayed fully workable across the whole season, and a standard gooseberry underplanted with lettuce or herbs below it produced 2 crops from the same square foot without any extra work. Climbing beans across Victorian kitchen gardens went up hazel or birch brushwood cut from the hedgerows bordering the plot in late winter, pushed directly into the soil before sowing, and branching twigs held the beans more securely in wind than any smooth cane with no string or clips ever needed. The whole structure went to the compost heap at the end of the season without sorting, renewed itself from the same hedges each February, and cost nothing. If you are finding this useful, hit the like button now and subscribe, because there are 16 more of these to come. And the section on soil preparation is the one most people have never heard of. Sea kale has become so unfamiliar that most modern gardeners do not recognize the name, which tells you something about how thoroughly a standard Victorian winter vegetable can disappear from memory. Each November, established crowns went under a large inverted terracotta pot with a stone blocking the drainage hole to cut out every trace of light, and within 6 to 8 weeks, pale pink blanched shoots pushed up in complete darkness, cut at the base in January and brought straight to the kitchen table. Those shoots combined the sweetness of asparagus with the delicacy of forced chicory, required no heat, no glass, and nothing imported, and the crowns producing them lived for decades. What vanished was not the plant, but the one piece of knowledge behind it. Taking light away from a crown entirely transforms what it grows. Cucumbers in Victorian kitchen gardens never went outdoors on the ground, but into frames, lateral shoots trained horizontally on a low net, and male flowers removed by hand before they could reach the female ones, because a pollinated cucumber turned bitter and full of seed rather than tender and mild. One correctly managed plant in a frame produced fruit from May through September, and hand-tending the flowers each morning was something every serious Victorian gardener understood without being told. A modern packet of cucumber seeds carries none of that instruction, which is why the results are so often disappointing. Melons appeared on Victorian kitchen garden records alongside peaches and grapes as expected late summer fruits, produced in Britain by sustaining heated manure pits beneath frames across the growing season, temperature managed by hand, ventilation adjusted to prevent scorching, and female flowers pollinated with a soft brush at the right moment. Beyond the seed, nothing came from a shop. Glass bell jars, each about the size of a large upturned bowl, covered individual tender plants on cold spring mornings in Victorian kitchen gardens, and came off again in the afternoon to prevent scorching, and 50 of them spread across a bed in March pushed the salad harvest forward by a full month against any unprotected growing nearby. Many of those sets still exist, turning up in antique shops and sold as ornamental objects by people who have no idea what they were actually made to do. 2 full years of preparation passed before a single asparagus spear was cut, and beds built that way stayed productive for 20 years or more. Ground was double dug, the lower level packed with well-rotted manure, and crowns planted on raised ridges that let water drain freely from the roots, because crowns sitting in waterlogged soil failed within 2 seasons, while correctly drained ones produced reliably for the lifetime of the holder. A light scattering of salt went over the bed each year, which asparagus carries without difficulty, and most competing weeds cannot survive, and the work front-loaded itself into those first 2 years and asked almost nothing after. Charcoal from wood fires went into planting holes for fruit trees and permanent soft fruit bushes across Victorian kitchen gardens, broken and crushed before the roots were set into it, and generations of observation showed that trees planted into charcoal-improved ground established faster and produced stronger root systems than those going into unimproved clay. The material that made this possible arrived as a byproduct of the fire already burning through every winter. 3 years was the limit for a strawberry bed in Victorian allotment practice, and in that 3rd year, the strongest runners from the best-performing plants were pegged into prepared ground in a new section of the plot before the old bed was dug in entirely. Keeping a strawberry bed beyond that point built up soil disease and dropped fruit quality steadily, while pegging runners cost nothing and the plant replaced itself without any outside input. Layering multiplied fruit bushes across Victorian allotments at a rate that required no spending, a low-growing branch bent to the soil, nicked on the underside where it made contact, pegged in place, and covered. Within 1 growing season, the buried section had developed its own roots and could be cut free and transplanted, and one established gooseberry bush produced 12 new plants this way in a single season at the cost of an afternoon, with spare plants moving between neighboring plots without charge. Fruit tree trunks across Victorian kitchen gardens went white each autumn, a wash of diluted slaked lime applied from ground level to the first main branches with a stiff brush. Codling moth, apple sawfly, and other pests sheltering their eggs in the bark through winter died on contact, and the moss and lichen that harbored further populations were cleared at the same time. 1 bucket and 1 brush covered an entire section in a morning, and Victorian orchardists knew that what lived in the bark through winter determined what hatched against the crop in spring. Mushrooms featured as a standard section in Victorian kitchen garden manuals alongside vegetable growing and fruit, and any garden with a north-facing frame or a shaded space under a bench was expected to produce them through autumn and winter. Horse manure beds cased with a shallow layer of loam received mushroom spawn, broken into pieces and pressed in, then sat in consistent darkness and humidity. A stable shaded space, correctly prepared manure, and 6 weeks were all the method required. Many crops across Victorian kitchen gardens received water through shallow furrows, drawn between the rows with a hoe before planting, poured into the channel, and allowed to travel the length of the row rather than falling from above onto the leaves. Wet foliage in the evenings invited disease that Victorian gardeners had no interest in managing, and roots watered from below drove deeper into the soil rather than spreading shallowly in pursuit of surface moisture. Globe artichokes went along the exposed boundaries of Victorian kitchen garden plots as productive windbreaks, growing to 6 feet and forming a dense canopy while producing a harvest of heads at the same time. Shelter for the tender crops behind the row and a harvest from the plants themselves came from the same ground, with no additional input required of any kind. Sewing books ran Victorian kitchen gardens as much as the soil did. Handwritten records of what went in on which date and what it produced by which date, used year after year to plan the succession so the harvest never stopped. Lettuce went in every 3 weeks across the season, peas in 3 separate batches at 3-week intervals, and radishes filled every gap between slower crops before the ground cooled, always followed by something else before the season closed. Planning ran backward from the table to the seed row, and the only tools the sewing book required were a pencil and the discipline to pick it up. Root pruning was the standard Victorian answer to a fruit tree that grew strongly but refused to produce, and the logic behind it is direct. A trench was dug around the tree each autumn at the distance of the canopy's edge. Larger, spreading roots cut cleanly through with a spade, and the finer feeding roots left intact. Restricting the root system slowed the vigorous growth and sent the tree into heavy flowering the following spring, with no product involved, only the understanding that cutting the roots was exactly what the tree needed. A close relative of the globe artichoke, the cardoon was grown in Victorian kitchen gardens not for its flower heads, but for its stems, gathered upward in late summer, tied at the top, and wrapped in hessian or straw to cut out all light from the central growth. 3 to 4 weeks of darkness turned those stems pale, tender, and mild, losing the bitterness they carried in full light, and they came to the winter table as a hot vegetable side dish. Grown along bed margins where the tide column cast no shade on neighboring crops, the cardoon served the plot and the kitchen both, and has been almost entirely absent from British growing since the early 20th century. Limiting what a plant was allowed to carry was the most direct route to larger, better produce in Victorian kitchen garden practice, and this applied across a range of crops. Secondary flower clusters came off gooseberries, side trusses were pinched from tomatoes, and smaller developing bulbs were removed from onion sets before they could compete with the main one, concentrating everything the plant had into what remained. Fewer results of higher quality over many results of poor quality was the principle, and the hand discipline that delivered it has largely gone from how growing is taught today. 20 methods, none of them requiring a product in a bag or a bottle on a shelf. Victorian allotment holders solved every growing problem we now pay for, and they solved it with what was already in the garden, the hedgerow, or the fire grate. What killed these off was not a better idea coming along to replace them, but an industry that found it could sell a product in place of knowledge people once inherited without spending anything. The Victorian kitchen gardener training fruit flat against a south wall, forcing sea kale under an inverted pot in January, pressing charcoal into every planting hole, was not behind the times. That gardener was ahead of every problem, addressing it with nothing before anyone had worked out how to charge for the solution. If you found something worth trying here, share this with someone who still has ground to grow on, and subscribe if you have not already, so we can keep adding to what the gardening industry would rather stay forgotten.